Thank you for joining and welcome to LeadDev Bookmarked, a monthly book club for engineering leaders. LeadDev is a global community of leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Make sure to join the LeadDev Slack workspace. We'll take some questions live and then continue the discussion there afterwards. You can find details at theleaddeveloper.com/bookmarked. I'm Susan, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and a leadership coach. My specialty is tech leaders. Today, we'll be talking about become an effective software engineering manager with our guest author, James Stanier, who I've been talking to. That's James. Dr. James Stanier is a computer science PhD who made the jump from software engineer to manager and has never looked back. He's currently SVP Engineering at Brandwatch, a SaaS platform that brings meaning to the world's conversations. He is based in Brighton, UK, and has built web-scale real-time data processing pipelines, and teams of people both are challenging. Welcome.
That's true. Hey, thank you for having me.
So looking forward to talking with you. I'd love to just hear the background. I always love to hear, like, how did this book come about?
Sure. I mean, I never intended it to be a book, if I'm honest. Originally, I started a blog, and that was 3 years ago. And it started with all blogs where you spend a lot of time finding a domain name before you even thought about what you're going to write. And I managed to get the engineeringmanager.com. That's great. Have that domain name. And then you spend a lot of time wondering what technology platform you're going to use to host the blog, and then you waste weeks of, anyway, all that aside. Anyway.
We've all been there. I feel like anyone who's creative has been there.
But the idea was that at work, and I guess we can talk about sort of my journey into management in a bit, but lots of people, either I was coaching or I had as direct reports, but we're just asking me advice on being new managers. How do they manage people? What do you do? And I thought, well, I should probably write some stuff down. And I thought, well, once a week, I'll write a short blog post on these subjects and try and over time build up a little repository of, hey, new manager, here's all the stuff that you need to know, and I'll do it as this blog. I kind of got a bit carried away, and I wrote a post every week for 2.5 years. And it went down pretty well. Like, people at work liked it. I got lots of good feedback on Twitter. I had a few Hacker News front pages, some Medium features, and just with time, I really enjoyed the writing process, and I connected with a whole bunch of new people, which was lovely. And after that 2.5 years or so, I looked back at everything I wrote and I said, there's almost a book here. And people would jokingly say, hey, when are you going to write a book? And I didn't take them seriously at first. And then I thought, you know what, that would be really nice. Because I know that I personally really struggled a while ago when I had my first management role, because I didn't know what I was doing. And I think that's not uncommon. I think that happens to many people. And I wish at the time there was just like the one book that had all the basics, all the extra bits on top that would just make me feel really comfortable in my role. So I thought, hey, I could do that. And I wrote some emails to some publishers and said, hey, I think this could be something worthwhile. And they thought the same, and it went from there.
Yeah, and so when you got into writing the book, you know, it's quite comprehensive. I mean, it's 300 and some pages.
I mean, it would hurt if it landed on your head. It's a big book. Yeah. Yeah, it is comprehensive. And I think that was the struggle with this, is that I know a lot of the books that you see out there in the business realm are often based around like a core concept. Something like Drive is around autonomy, mastery, and purpose at the start. And then the rest of the book is sort of a riff on lots of use cases and applications of that. But I really wanted something that was more a bit like the textbooks that I was used to in school. You know, it really has everything in there, where people can flick through time as they face a new challenge, as they come up to performance reviews, or if they're hiring people, like there's a chapter for that. That's what I really wanted. So it was more of a field guide approach, like a manual approach. So it took quite a bit of time with the publisher to work on the table of contents in such a way that it had enough so that it covered everything comprehensively, but also it wouldn't bore the reader. And it also gave a lot of links to things that were out of scope for the book. So it took some time to organize it, and it also took some time to write it, for sure. But
yeah, how long
I'm really
did it take
pleased.
to write it?
So I signed the contract with the publisher just over a year ago, and then I pretty much I tried to do at least half an hour a day on weekdays, and then the weekends were bigger blocks of writing of multiple hours on Saturdays and Sundays. And then over the course of the year, it all came together. So yeah, it took about a year.
Got it. One last quick question. Did those 2.5 years of blog posts, how much of that is in the book now versus brand new material?
It's all been rewritten. There's minimal, if any, sort of verbatim cut and paste, because I think the format is totally different. You know, the blog post, you need to get it across in a 10-minute read, if that. The book has to have a narrative that goes through. One of the things with the book is I've sort of added a very short story at the beginning of each chapter, just to kind of put the reader in a position. And there's some characters that go throughout. And I'm not a fiction writer, but I think I winged it and got away with it just enough to make people feel that there's some orientation and some connectivity from chapter to chapter.
Yeah, I think also those stories bring it to life. You know, I love it when you bring it to life and make it a little more real. Okay, so I'm curious. So you're now an SVP of engineering. I'm curious about your career path. How did you get there? And, you know, just a little bit of background would be great, I think. So, because I'm sure there's folks here who are, you know, engineering managers who are like, oh, wait, how did he get there? I want to maybe be there one day.
Sure. I mean, there's some portion of work, but there's a big portion of luck. And I think with these kinds of roles where you do end up with the silly acronym at the front of your name, or the VPs and the SVPs, there is also right place, right time. And there is a part of the book that I talk about on how to join smaller companies and look for opportunities there as they grow. And that very much reflects my own path, which was, I was one of the early stage employees at a startup. And as we started to form more teams, I was interested in management, and I put myself forward to say, hey, I'd love to do this, and just grew with the company, really. And I think everybody who's had a CTO role or a VP role has not always gone into a large existing company and worked their way up. I think that's quite rare. I think often you have to go somewhere smaller and then look for opportunity to grow. And that reflects my own experience. So I guess my own entry point as well as a manager, I wouldn't even want to be a manager. Like I did a PhD in compilers. Like that's nothing to do with management, right? It's very technical, very, you know, traditionally computer sciencey. And again, I was looking for an academic job at the end of my PhD, but there were none at the time. Funding was very dry in the UK, and I didn't want to change countries. So I had a sidestep and I joined the startup, and I was like, okay, I'll write some code. That sounds fun. Did that for a while, and then as we grew, I was like, oh yeah, management sounds interesting, and I'll go from there.
When you know, I mean, compilers are super different than people. At least I don't know much about compilers, but I assume they're different than people.
I mean, at least they have error messages. People don't.
Oh gosh, wouldn't it be great if people had error messages like over their head? Okay, maybe not. Maybe I don't know. I don't know what people think. But you know, what was your biggest challenge in maybe transitioning from, you know, into management? Was one thing maybe that you think that made it into the book, or that you were challenged with?
Sure. I mean, there's multiple. I mean, one of them certainly that I faced is that I didn't have any coaching at the time. I mean, I had a manager, but that manager was the founding CTO, who was basically the chief hacker. You know, he wasn't a manager. So I didn't have a huge network of people to learn from. I didn't have access to any coaching or any budget for any coaching. So also one of the reasons that I wrote the book was many people have been in that situation.
Yep.
And you just want something. And I tried to get around that at the time by talking to people I knew in other companies to see whether I could get advice. I bought tons of books. Now the situation's a lot better for engineering managers. There is more stuff out there, I mean, including my own book. But back then, sort of 10 years ago, I was reading these very business-oriented books that I felt didn't really speak to me. Great, so the CEO of a Fortune 500 company does this, but that's a different world from me and my small team. And I just really wanted like applicable advice, you know, like playbooks, almost like for how you document a system that you work for. Like, what do I do in these situations? And what do I do when I hire people? What do I do in one-to-ones? And I just wanted to get it all down so that I could just open it and have something to guide me. And that's what I wanted. So that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, it's like writing a book for 10 years ago, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's the
I
big
love
head
that.
fake. I didn't write it for anybody else. No one. I only wrote this for me, but in the past.
But I think it's really helpful when authors do that, because they can look back and put themselves in the shoes, and they've walked that path and know a lot of those challenges and can really inform it, So if we think about like new managers, delegation is a big challenge for a lot of new managers. And you lay out a really nice framework in the book for delegation. Can you explain a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah, sure. So I guess that delegation, when it goes badly, manifests in two ways that people often know about. So everyone's been micromanaged at some point. The manager who just wants you to do something but just can't let go of it, won't release control, does it for you, makes you feel stupid. We've all been there. But there's also the other end of the scale, which is the whole fire and forget thing. So someone who forwards you the email with no context, you don't know what you're meant to do with it, you ignore it, then they come back 2 weeks later, why haven't you done that thing? It's like, huh? What? So those are the two bad ends of the scale. But delegation is a scale where at one end you do it yourself with no delegation whatsoever. On the other end, somebody does it completely themselves. But there is a continuum in between, which I think a lot of people don't realize. So delegation isn't just telling people what to do, and it's not doing it yourself. How you move along that continuum is to do with letting go of control, and that gets you from one end to the other. And it also comes through coaching, teaching, giving people the right environment to do the task. And for managers, it's knowing the person that they're delegating to, and it's knowing their skills, it's knowing what's just outside of their comfort zone, what's in their comfort zone, and then being able to give them the work with the right amount of autonomy, the right amount of check-ins at the right amount of intervals, so that they can do the job well, feel that they have autonomy, and also learn. And depending on the task, depending on the person, you can pick somewhere on this scale of letting go enough and giving enough, so it's beneficial for both parties.
Yeah, I love the connection. I think we often don't make enough of a connection between like delegation and career development, and that delegation isn't just about scaling ourselves and having more capacity as a leader or a manager, but it's also about when we delegate we can build capacity in our team.
Oh, absolutely. And you can build capacity in yourself. I mean, one of the things that I have said in the book as well is that if you, as a manager, and especially if you do progress to manager of managers, if you're really good at delegating, not only does everyone that works for you have amazing opportunities to do more and take on more, you gain capacity, which allows you to take on more or to be there. If there are things that happen in spontaneous moments and you need to drop everything, you can. It's cool. You've got the capacity. So delegation works for everybody. It's not just I'm making you do stuff. It's that you're learning, I'm getting the ability to do more. Everyone benefits. It's great.
Such a great point. Just really wanted to highlight that. So in the chapter, continuing on the delegation note, in the chapter I'm interfacing with humans, you talk about two pretty familiar topics, which delegation and communication, but you also mention one that might be less obvious, but just as powerful, which is having engineering managers build a strong relationship with their own manager. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about why you think this is important, and maybe a couple of tools that managers can use to start building a strong relationship with their manager, like the managing up,
Yeah, thing. It's funny, isn't it? That term managing up, like often the thing it brings to your mind immediately is some kind of political thing, or how do I spin what I'm doing so that it comes off positively. But I think actually it's a positive thing. Regardless of who your manager is, you can always get more from them as their direct report. And there are a number of different ways. So some of the tools that I talk about in the book are obviously fundamentals. Like you want to be having weekly one-to-ones with them. If you're not, and they're not initiating that, then you should initiate that. You book it in, make it happen. Try and set up that relationship with your manager so it really works for you. And
it does happen sometimes.
It does,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's surprising. It does happen. Like sometimes that managers having the one-on-one, it happens. Sometimes that it gets slipped or doesn't, happen as often as it maybe the manager might like.
Absolutely. And I think just framing the relationship between you and your manager less as they are pushing onto me, but more I'm pulling on them, changes it a lot. It's more, well, hey, they're a great resource. Like they're probably more senior, they're more senior in the organization, they're doing a whole lot of interesting stuff. Like, how can I get some of that? How can I open up some avenues to experience that myself and grow myself? So, taking, one of them is not always your one-to-ones being about them pushing onto you, but you asking them questions like, what is it that they're working on? What's taking up their time? What sort of stuff are they talking about in their kind of meetings and things that they're working on? Is there any opportunity for you to help them? It can work both ways. And again, it goes back to delegation. Like, what could they delegate to you that might even be outside of your current job or remit that allows you to experience more? I mean, maybe if you're reporting to the CTO and there's a whole budgeting part of the department that you've never seen before to do with planning for CapEx and OpEx and all that kind of thing. You're like, hey, I'm interested in that. Can I do the next quarter with you? Can you show me how it works? I'd love to learn. And those might not be things necessarily that your manager thinks you'd be interested in. And they go, oh, I just won't even mention that because it's probably boring. Like, who cares? But actually, it could be really interesting to you. And all you need to do is say, hey, show me what you're up to. Lift the lid on their job and look in.
I love that too. What I take from that is a bit like what I hear underneath that is being an active part in your career development and being actively seeking opportunities for advice, feedback, for growth with your manager.
Absolutely. And talking of growth and kind of performance, and again, performance can be a bit of a dirty word, but thinking of it positively, having that discussion with your manager, especially if they are a manager of managers, and saying, hey, so what is it that you do that means you perform well? Who does your performance review? What do they look for? What are you judged against? Do you have KPIs or is it subjective? What is it that means you do a good job? Because I'm interested in helping you and helping everything be successful. So how can I contribute? And again, that can open up, well, actually, there's all these things that I have to do at the moment that I can't handle. I'd love for you to help. It can work both ways for sure. I have one more tool, actually, if you're interested.
Oh, yeah, tell me.
Again, that kind of push and pull thing, one thing that worked quite well for me, especially when my manager was distributed, was every single week just writing them a summary of things that are on my mind. I mean, they could be important things, they could be not important things, but I do it right now with my current manager because he's based in Boston. And just at the end of every week, I just drop him 5 to 10 bullet points of just things that are on my mind. And we just have an asynchronous chat over the coming week before we meet again in our one-to-one. And that clears off a lot of the conversation beforehand so that when we do meet, we have a really productive one-to-one where we talk about the interesting stuff rather than the administrative stuff.
Oh, that's so good. Turning it from more of a, richer development conversation than just like a status meeting, which, that can happen often in any kind of one-on-one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and let's talk about that. As we mentioned, one-on-one, you talk about the concept of contracting a manager's first one-on-one with a direct report. That was a new term to me. So I was curious, what is this and how does that work?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't come up with this term. I learned it through some management training that I did do. There was a local company, just 2 people in Brighton, management consultants, called Conscious Business People. They introduced it to me. But the idea is that, as a manager, you form new relationships with your staff, with your peers, with your own manager. And definitely, if either you're joining a new company, you don't know anybody particularly well, but also if you're being promoted from within, sometimes your relationship can change with your peers. Someone who was your peer is now your direct report. There's lots of awkwardness that can potentially flow out of that. So this whole contracting thing, it comes from the word contract, and all it really is you spend your first one-to-one going through these questions, and you both prepare beforehand, but both of you privately before you meet, you spend some time thinking about which are the areas that you'd both like support with in the relationship that you're going to form. How is it that you'd like to receive that support and that feedback? Is it synchronous and asynchronous thing? Is it spontaneous? Is it planned? You think through like what the challenges could be of working together. And those could be very practical things like we are on a different time zone. But those could also be things to do with personality. It could be like, well, I'm an introvert and you're an extrovert. And I know that we clash when we talk about things because of the way that our personalities are. So how can we work through that? How might we know if the relationship's not going well? You know, maybe the rapport is so good that we can just call it out and say, hey, things are a bit odd right now. But equally, there are people who would feel uncomfortable doing that. So are there emotional, physical cues between a manager and a direct report where you can see that things are taking a turn for the worse, maybe they're becoming more quiet, the conversation's drying up. And then just a little one at the end, which is to do with how confidential those one-to-ones are. You know, is it the case that if we were having a one-to-one together and you mentioned something to me, do I have permission to like go and talk to my boss about that without asking you? I mean, often some awkwardness can happen if you don't clear that out up front. So it's simple questions.
Yeah, I love that. That was one of my favorite parts of the book. And I feel like something folks don't talk about quite enough. So it stood out for me. As a coach, you know, we always have this thing where we have like what I call like a foundation session, and we talk about all those things. We set the stage so that the space feels safe. We know where the boundaries are. We know what we can talk about, not talk about. We talk about confidentiality. We talk about things like, is it okay to swear? What happens if we have if we have like a bobble in our communication? And for me, it is the most powerful part of the entire work you can do in setting up a relationship, which is the same thing as a manager and a direct report. You're really building that relationship, is to talk about the talking. And so then it's less awkward later, I feel like, when something inevitably goes a little bit weird.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if you feel the same way, that that you also feel like it builds that relationship.
Yeah, I agree, because it's quite candid stuff that you get out of the way straight away. But the good part of that is it builds that rapport instantly. You know, it's two people really talking about some quite personal stuff to begin with and framing that relationship. So it means that everything else from there is easier. And, you know, with new managers or managers who are, they're new to the game, they've never had any training, any coaching, it could be awkward. It's like, wow, I've got 5 or 6 hours of one-to-ones every week now, and what do I talk about? And I can't talk about that. So I'll just talk about the status of all your projects, and we'll just sit down every week and you'll tell me how your projects are going. And that's great, but I think there's more to that relationship that can come.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really important concept. So, you know, thinking about your background, one of the other things that stood out about the book was being the first manager at a startup. And I'm curious about like how the experience is different, and maybe someone who might be the first manager at a startup, what you think they need to know.
Yeah, I mean, the good part is that everything is applicable. I mean, there is a place for management at a startup. I mean, when we were a startup, you know, people had a manager, but the manager was a CTO, and that kind of meant that every 6 months they sat down and did a performance review of a kind, but there weren't weekly one-to-ones. There wasn't that relationship. It was just dishing out work and just doing work and sort of hustling together. But all of the skills, I think, as manager number one are super important. I think it's an author called Mark Suster wrote a blog post where there's kind of a grid of sort of technical competency and sort of process orientation. And if you're the first manager, you tend to have both, actually. You're sort of a technical contributor, but you are really on top of the process and the people as well. And that's typically that VP engineering role at a startup, the sort of the counterpart to the CTO. The CTO is the hacker, the VP engineering is the process and the people person, thinking of hiring and everything. But being that first manager at a startup it's not the job that no one wants to do. I think it's actually the framework for many things cultural, in that as the first manager of a startup, you can begin to do things in such a way that will grow with the staff that you hire, because they are hired into the way that you do things. So if you do have that opportunity of being the first manager, you can set a culture of great management relationships, really good performance reviews, have an amazing hiring process, career progression. You can do I could go on. You could get all this stuff done up front, so that everyone else who onboards gets to reap the benefit of that work.
Yeah, it strikes me as the difference between maybe this might be a bad analogy, but like legacy code, getting code that's already written versus that green field, and you get to create it. And that's just what strikes me there, is that when you're the first manager, you get to create it rather than maybe coming into what an already well-developed culture and systems.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I've got an example of that right now that we're going through. So for example, GitLab I believe they're fully remote as a company, and they have a handbook that's on their website. So I think you just go to the gitlab.com site, go to the handbook, and pretty much since day one, because they've been a fully distributed company, they have documented pretty much everything from the abstract, here are quarterly OKRs, right down to, you know, here's how you put a ticket into the HR system, but everything's written, and they use that as their hub of documentation and communication. And because they've done it since the start, that's been the culture, that's been the artifact of the original managers at the company, and it's just the way that they do things. And I'm feeling the reverse pain at the moment, where through the pandemic, we went remote distributed for obvious reasons, but the company's decided to continue that. So anyone who can work remotely, wants to work remotely, can. But we now find ourselves with this kind of documentation void. So I'm kicking off a project at the moment to write the engineering handbook. And because it hasn't been ingrained in our culture since the beginning, I feel that not only do we have to develop it, I have to convince everybody this is a great idea, and I have to try and find my advocates to come along with me and contribute. And if you do that from the beginning, it's so much easier to carry it forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point. I've got one last question, but before, I want to insert something, because you talked about the pandemic and moving, and, you know, do you have any bits of advice or things that you've learned during the pandemic, that some of those shifts that might be relevant for engineering managers listening in?
And I got to admit, like my own personal feelings every day is very, very different. Some days I feel great. Some days I feel really bummed.
Yeah.
It's affected everyone in so many different ways.
Yeah.
I have seen a big, at least at our company, there's a real split that I'm worried about in the future, which is that typically people who were physically co-located, who have domain knowledge, who have expertise, are more willing to be remote in the future, which is fine. But then what does that mean for supporting new engineers, junior engineers, graduates, where that physical place at the beginning of their career journey was so important for them to find community, social group, receive mentorship. And I'm fairly concerned about how we continue that in the future and give them the support that they need. Hence this whole documentation effort, but it's still challenging. I mean, I could talk about the list of worries. I mean, things that I found myself is that I'm fortunate that I like writing. So the whole asynchronous communication thing, I love. But I also know it's not everyone else's cup of tea. And again, because of the culture shift rapidly with the pandemic, rather than us being like that since day one, it's been very, very hard. I feel that some voices in our company have amplified, but many people have sort of faded away. They are still there, but they're just not, they're an in-person communicator rather than an asynchronous written communicator. And it's challenging.
I love hearing that, because I think that we're all feeling it. I think anyone who's had to change through this pandemic, and that's pretty much all of us, is feeling that. And so I want to normalize that and know that, like, I'm sure, like, and then your feelings shifting from day to day, like sometimes better and worse, is great just to hear from a leader that they're also experiencing that.
It's just hard. Like, what do you say? It's really challenging. Like there is no predictable end in sight right now. And I think because of the pandemic being so closely linked to the economy, which is therefore so closely linked to us and our jobs and the success of our companies, it's just this arc that's stretched over our home life and our career and our workplace, and everything's changed. And I think I just feel personally, I've just been listening more in one-to-ones. I'm just asking people how they feel. I'm giving people space. I'm hearing people out. You know, people have got difficulties with their families, either illness or they haven't been able to see them. And there are no answers to these questions. You just have to be there.
Yeah. And I mean, I know I experience it when I'm coaching with my leaders. They're also experiencing it. They have kids at home, you know, they're more used to being co-located and having conversations. And I'm finding even some of my experienced, VP engineering, CTO, COOs, also working with their own styles having to change, and then looking at how other folks, and like so how do I help them adjust, like let's say more extroverted people who need that interaction, they need it in person, how do they help? So it's great to hear. Thank you for being willing to share a little bit about your own struggles or experience and what you're thinking about. I think that's probably helpful for people to hear.
Sure. I mean, I'm also acutely aware of like being, a bit more tenured and experienced than some of the people that I work with. I've been in industry longer. I've had a job for longer. So I actually have like a nice home space. I have a place I can work. That's great. But we have so many people who don't, they're on the kitchen table, they share a house, like everybody is so different in so many different ways. And it's just as much as possible, just trying to be present and understanding of people. Some people are even loving the work from home and the isolation. They don't want to talk to people. They love just their own space. But I think it's just shown to me just even more just how different and diverse people's lives are, and their situations, their home situations, their work situations. But it's fostered a community in a different way, more understanding, more supportive of each other, and just more flexible and caring.
Yeah. It really brings back to me the notion of just listening. I think sometimes when we get into more of a leadership space, we think we have to tell, and a lot of times it's really about listening. So I love that you mentioned that, and it's a great reminder. So I have one last question, and this is a hard one given that it's a 300 and some page book. But what is maybe one thing you hope people take away from the book? I know I'm limiting you.
Good question. I mean, I think that the last chapter actually I think is useful. So the final chapter of the book is a fairly in-depth sort of career planning, career trajectory type exercise that you can do as a reader, but it's written in such a way that you can take away and do it with all of your staff. And I think if people read none of the book, but just extracted that chapter, I think they would bring a lot of value to everybody that they work with. It projects out into the future. It allows them to think about work and life, and then kind of backtracks from there and chops it down into sort of 5 years, 3 years, 1 year, and comes up with some sort of goals that you can almost track on a Trello board to feel that you're actually progressing on some things that are important to you. So that's one bit that they could take away, and I think that they'd enjoy. And as I mentioned, it would hurt if it fell on your head. So don't put it near any windows. Strong winds. It's a big book.
It's a tome. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful resource. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with me, James. I had so much fun. I know I have a million more questions, but we'll, thank you everyone for watching. We're going to give all of you opportunity to ask your own questions to James. So you can join the discussion on Bookmarked channel. The Bookmarked channel on Slack. James will be there to answer your questions for the next little bit. And as a reminder, LeadDev Bookmarked is a monthly book club. So next month, we're speaking with Manuel Pais and Matthew Skelton on team topologies. So thanks again for everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.